Hello again. Existing non-domestic buildings. So this morning we heard about existing dwellings, and Sam's just talking about new non-domestic buildings. The presentation is actually quite similar because the approach we take to existing non-domestic buildings is fairly similar to existing domestic buildings, except we have different standards. So I'm going to rattle fairly quickly through this because I'm conscious many of you were here this morning and I don't want to repeat too many things, but at the same time some people may just come for the afternoon. So we're going to discuss introduction, we're going to talk about how we can improve current energy efficiency standards, consequential improvements again, and conservatories and porches. So very similar to what we talked about this morning, big focus on new build, but the big benefits are to be made to existing build. So making improvements to standards for existing build is likely to have bigger energy carbon savings than the work for new build. In addition, we worked out from, you'll see in the impact assessment, there's some very big cost savings we can make. I think Sam showed before that you have new build chill efficiencies of 4.5, and for backstops and existing build you have 2.5. So there's actually quite a long way between existing build and new build, so you can actually improve standards, you can actually save an awful lot of energy and an awful lot of money. And again, like we showed this morning, the amount of buildings we have at the moment, existing non-domestic buildings we have at the moment, what happens on our pathway to happens on our pathway to 2050, and what we find is most of the buildings in 2050 already been built today, and I guess I think these numbers go down over time, which does reflect demolition of buildings. So we're going to be talking about improving standards of existing energy efficiency standards. Colin later is going to talk about improving compliance. We're also going to talk today about bringing more building work into scope. So one area we can improve is the current energy efficiency standards. We recommend standards for controlled fittings, typically windows, and a wide range of building services. Again, energy efficiency gains are locked into the product, the services, the windows. So there's very little hassle for the installer to put in more energy efficiency products if they are cost effective. In general, we don't propose to change the guidance for controlled fittings because actually they're quite close to the notional buildings that Sam presented just before. However, we do propose some changes to the non-domestic building services compliance guide, and what we're finding, making relatively small changes as they're across the big range of non-domestic buildings, and as services are a big energy use of non-domestic buildings, they actually make a huge energy saving, they actually make a huge cost gain over the life cycle of the building. In non-domestic buildings, if you construct an extension that's bigger than 100 metres squared, or greater than 25% of the total floor area of the existing buildings, that's ADL 2A. So we're talking about ADL 2B, so that's smaller extensions. And again, ADL 2B recommends minimum energy efficiency standards for the thermal elements, for the glazing, and for the fixed building services that go into the extension. Again, it may be reasonable to achieve close to new build standards because there's not too many design constraints on building an extension. In general, again, we don't propose to improve the guidance for controlled fittings or thermal elements as they're close to the new build standards that Sam has just presented. Where we do propose improvements, again, is the non-domestic compliance guide, in line with what DCLG is proposing for England as well. So all the changes we're proposing for the domestic and the non-domestic building services compliance guide, we're aligning with the proposals for England. The one area we're proposing to add for non-domestic buildings this time is extensions for buildings that are essentially domestic in character. Already there's a separate requirement for windows in buildings that are essentially domestic in character. We're talking about extending it to the other fabric elements. So buildings that are essentially domestic in character are buildings where the occupancy levels and hence the internal gains are very similar to domestic. So you have things like student accommodation, things like care homes, where they're more, the internal gains are similar to a domestic situation than, let's say, an office where you'd have maybe greater occupancy density, you'd have more IT equipment, so higher heat gains in these more non-domestic scenarios. And what we're proposing where buildings are more similar to domestic is that they should have higher fabric standards, more akin to dwellings than non-domestic buildings. So these are the proposed changes for 2013, which, as Francois said, would come into force in 2014. So on the left-hand side, you have buildings that are essentially domestic in character. On the right-hand side, you've got the other non-domestic buildings. In red on there, you can see the proposed changes to Part L. And there's several places where there's strike-throughs, and they were the old standards. So what we're proposing for, say, buildings of essentially domestic in character is that the standards are going to be tougher. For other non-domestic buildings, in general, they're pretty similar to where they are now. For the wall U value, it's moved from 0.28 to 0.26. That's in line with some SAM's proposals for the 2013 new build notional building. So there's a couple of questions in the consultation document related to that. Is, do you agree that the standards for non-domestic extensions are correct? And do you think the assessments of costs and benefits in there, which show the benefits of making these changes to Part L, are fair, reasonable, accurate? We talked earlier on about renovation of a thermal element for dwellings. We have the same sort of issues here again for non-domestic buildings. Anecdotally, there's a concern that even meeting today's standards, they're not complied with well. So if we simply raise the standards, are we really going to gain any benefit out of it? What we propose is more specific guidance given to the people that do the renovations, and we don't change the standards now, and so they've got time to get used to this new guidance, and they can start familiarising themselves and learning from these improvements in the current standards rather than raising the standards further. Again, retain thermal elements, things like material change of use, when you change from warehouse to an office, or existing elements becoming part of a thermal element through a conversion. Again, like for domestic, there is a common threshold. Only when you achieve better than the threshold do you need to improve your fabric to a certain standard. Again, we're proposing to remove the threshold because we want to improve the energy efficiency standards of these buildings when they undergo these building works. When you do a material change of use, you're effectively producing a new building, so why shouldn't you have something close to new building standards? Anecdotally, in any case, people don't tend to think about the threshold. They do tend to build to these to the higher new standards, and you only need to undertake this work if technically, functionally, and economically feasible. Consequential improvements, currently, as said before, there's standards for greater than 1,000 metres squared. So if you have a building which increases the carbon footprint above 1,000 metres squared, what you do is you try to take into account some of that increase in carbon by doing other improvement measures. The other improvement measures are unlikely to fully account for the increase in carbon from let's say having an extension, but they partially at least allow for that. Talked about before, the triggers currently are extensions, installation of a new fixed building service, so not a replacement of a fixed building service, but the installation of a new fixed building service. So if it didn't have a chiller before and you add a chiller to the building, that's initial revision of a fixed building service, and increasing the installed capacity of any fixed building service. And there's consequential measures that need to be carried out if you have those triggers. For non-domestic buildings below 1,000 metres squared, we propose now to trigger consequential improvements. We're proposing again just for extensions or increases in habitable spaces, not through increase in capacity on new building services. In many cases, below 1,000 metres squared, you're not going to be triggered by these. There doesn't tend to be newly installed fixed building services. It's much more common for there to be extensions and increased habitable spaces. Hence, we're trying to simplify. Hence, we're trying to focus on the most common types of triggers in 2013 Part L. There's a variety of measures that can be undertaken. You can undertake these measures through, there's the existing Table 6 of L2B, which gives you a list of measures. There's also the EPC recommendation report measures. There's also, you can undertake a Green Deal assessment, and they can give you cost-effective measures. Similar to last time, you need to, go back to the previous slides, you need to select measures to be capped at 10% of the principal works. We're looking at about 10% of the principal works in terms of these consequential measures to be done to your building. And again, right at the bottom, you only need to undertake consequential improvement measures where it is technically, functionally and economically feasible. So not if there's circumstances which don't really make sense to undertake these measures. So if you have a new building and you put on an extension, there's probably no real improvement you can make to your new building to take account of the increase by an extension. Again, there's a series of questions which we pose in the consultation document. Do you agree with the proposal to include consequential improvements for buildings below 1,000 metres squared? Do you agree with the proposal for consequential measures, the existing Table 6, or the EPC recommendation report, or Green Deal assessments? Do you agree, in terms of the building control process, there shouldn't be a problem in extending this to buildings below 1,000 metres squared? And do you think the cost and benefits which we've used to assess the proposal are fair, reasonable and accurate? And finally, a slide on conservatories and porches, same as presented this morning. Conservatories and porches are commonly exempt when the floor area is below 30 metres squared, where there's adequate thermal separation between the conservatory porch and the rest of the building, and where the heating system, a dwelling, I should say non-domestic building, is not extended into the conservatory or porch. As we said this morning, there's arguments to de-exempt conservatories as they use a lot of energy. Often you have, you don't in practice have thermal separation between the conservatory and the building. You have the doors open and they're used for a lot of the period of the year. But at the moment we're not proposing to remove the exemption. But what we're talking about is instead of allowing you to put fixed heating systems into your conservatory, we're suggesting you should only be exempt where there's no heating or cooling system in your conservatory or porch at all. Is that a sensible way forward, given the fact that the occupant could then just come in and put in, let's say, a portable heater, portable cooler? Does it really help the situation? That's the sort of feedback we want as part of the consultation. So question 35 in the consultation asks, do you agree that the exemption for conservatories should be removed when an individual room heater or air conditioning unit is installed? And there's a final question, question 43 in the consultation, which says, in addition to all these questions we've asked, is there any other points you wish to make which haven't been requested from the other questions? And that's a very short presentation.
Right. Any questions for David on existing non-domestic developments? No. Right. Okay.